Greetings, students. Here we go again, investigating the language of Wonderland known as logic. And today we want to talk about the distribution of terms, right? And by that we mean the distribution of the subject and predicate terms. And this is going to be important for us because it will help us evaluate arguments for validity. So there's a reason for learning all this. Now, if a term is distributed, it means that the term refers to each and every member of a class. If a term is undistributed, it means that it does not refer to each and every member of a class. Think about an A proposition, such as all S or P. What exactly does the form of this proposition assert? What exactly does it claim to be true or false? Well, it makes a claim about the entire subject class of S, each and every member of it, but what about the predicate class? Consider a substitution instance of all S or P. All whales are intelligent beings. As these two circles show, this means the class of whales is entirely included within the class of intelligent beings. So since we're talking about all whales, the subject term is distributed. But the predicate term, intelligent beings, is not distributed, right? There are intelligent beings that are outside the class of whales, such as the great apes, me and you, I hope, dolphins, chimps, and all other sorts of things like that. To mark this crucial distinction, we say here that in an A proposition, the subject term is distributed and the predicate term is undistributed. Now remember, distributed means the term refers to each and every member of a class, while undistributed means that it doesn't. So suppose I said I was going to give $20 to each and every member of the class. I was going to distribute $20 to each and every member of the class. If I distributed $20 to each of you, that means each and every one of you would get it, right? So think of distributing a term as giving something out to all, or to each and every one. So we then say a proposition distributes a term when something is being claimed about all members of the class named by it. It gives that term out to every member of the class. So we can say that an A proposition, which remember is a universal affirmative proposition, the subject term is always distributed. Something is always being said about each and every member of the class named by the subject term. It should be obvious in the three examples I have here that something is being said about each and every member of the subject class, but something is not being said about each and every member of the predicate class. Right? And we circled the term to indicate it's distributed. So here all frogs are amphibians. We're talking about every frog. Well, and one clear way to get at what I'm saying is, well, it's true that all frogs are amphibians. It's not true that all amphibians are frogs. Frogs is just part of the class of amphibians. But here, the term is distributed. Similarly, if I said all bats are mammals, or all lizards are reptiles, the subject term is distributed, while the predicate term is not. Now, E statements, right, no S or P, say something about every member of the subject class, but they also say something about every member of the predicate class as well. Right? For example, no birds are reptiles. We're saying every bird is excluded from the class of every reptile. And that also means every reptile is excluded from the class of every bird. So here we could reverse it with no problem, which is called converting terms. No birds are reptiles, no reptiles are birds. No fish are mammals, no mammals are fish. No bears are amphibians, no amphibians are bears. Right? Both the subject and the predicate are fully distributed. Now, I statements, which have the universal form of some S or P, do not distribute the subject nor the predicate, as is clear by what's said here. Some dogs are beagles, right? Well, we're just talking about some dogs, and we're just talking about some beagles. We're not talking about all beagles, and it doesn't say anything about all beagles, right? Finally, if we consider an O statement, O statements do not distribute the subject term. It should be obvious by the sum, but they do distribute the predicate term. This one's a little tricky for some people, so let's think about this a bit. If we say some animals are not cats, this means there is at least one animal that falls outside the entire class of cats. So if we think of every cat, there's some animal that's not a cat. Or suppose we said, some cats are not dogs. This means that a cat exists that is excluded from the entire class of dogs. Here's where you might feel like you're falling down the rabbit hole and going into Wonderland. Because you said, well, if we say some cats are not dogs, we're talking about all dogs, but you would say, isn't it true that all cats are not dogs? Well, it's true that all cats are not dogs, but if it's true that all cats are not dogs, it's equally true that some cats are not dogs, and here we're just talking about some of them. Remember how we interpret some in logic. We take it to mean at least one, and it's really an existence claim. It's saying something exists. So the statement, some dogs are animals, is one we call true. It might sound funny to you at first to say that this is true, since you might want to say, no, you idiot, all of them are. And you're quite right, of course, even though you're being, a little rude. But your being right that all of them are animals is completely consistent with my claiming only the weaker point, that at least one of them is. So remember that in logic, some only means there is at least one. And so if I said some squares are four-sided figures, it's true, even though it does not tell the whole story. Rather, these statements are true in what we call a trivial sense. Have you ever heard somebody say that, well, that's a trivial truth, right? If what you say is not the whole story, that does not mean that it must be false. In fact, that's something most of us know intuitively, and explains why from time to time we are tempted not to tell the whole story, right? Because under the right circumstances, at least we can say we were not lying. Now, why is this important, you ask? Well, the reason it's relevant is that when you build an argument using two or more categorical statements, as we're about to learn to do, the validity or invalidity is going to depend on whether or not connections are made between the categories. This means that if a term is never distributed in an argument, for example, then the categories in it do not overlap, and no explicit connections can be made, and so no conclusion will be able to follow as a result. And looking at whether terms are distributed or undistributed will give us a handy way of picking out whether an argument is valid or invalid when it's in the form of an Aristotelian syllogism. But the key point to remember, this is simply what you could memorize to pick these things out. Universal statements distribute their subject terms, and negative statements distribute their predicates, right? Or you could remember it like I have here. Just memorize all S are P, some S are P, no S are P, and some S are not P with the distributed terms circled. Now in your book, in the chapters, in the sections I've assigned, you'll see these nice charts summarizing a lot of what we've been talking about. Right? You have an A proposition, and it has its quantifier, as it's called, all S are P. And it's a universal affirmative. So we have subject, predicate, quantity, and quality. Right? E, no S or P, universal negative. I, some S or P, particular affirmative. O, some S or not P, particular negative. And you should have this chart memorized, as well as this one, right? At least in terms, you should be able to say these things. You don't have to have the actual chart memorized, but this is a nice way to sum it up. Right? And here we have quantity, quality, and distribution as it applies to A, E, I, and O. Right? All S or P, universal affirmative, the subject term is distributed. No S or P, universal negative, both subject and predicate are distributed. Some S or P, particular affirmative, there's no distribution in any term. Some S are not P, particular negative, and the predicate is distributed. So here's a little exercise which might be similar to something you would find on an exam. For each of the following propositions, identify the subject and predicate terms, the quantity, the quality, and then give its form letter, A, I, E, or O. For example, no aardvarks or fish. Right? So the subject is aardvarks. The predicate is fish. It's a universal negative and has the form of an E. Right? Some trees are not oaks. Right? The subjects are trees. Oaks are the predicate. It's a particular negative, and that makes it an O. Right? All trees are plants. Trees are the subject class. Plants are the predicate class. It's a universal affirmative, and it's an A. Right? Some trees are elms. It's an I. The subject is trees. Reptiles is the predicate. It's a particular affirmative, and it's an I, and so on, right? So, some Star Wars fans are philosophy professors who teach logic, right? So, the subject is Star Wars fans. The predicate is philosophy professors who teach logic, and that's an I. Sometimes I have to stop and think about it. And it's a particular affirmative. Similarly, I could ask you to identify the quantity and the quality and the distribution. For example, suppose we have the statement, all hobbits are lovers of second breakfast. Well, that's a universal affirmative. The subject term is distributed, and the predicate term is undistributed. So, some running shoes are not objects worth smelling. Now, there's a true statement, if there ever was one, right? Well, that's a particular negative, and the subject term is undistributed, and the predicate term is distributed. Some computer games are true works of art. That's a particular affirmative, and both terms are undistributed. All glasses of ice-cold tea are thirst-quenching beverages. That's a universal affirmative, and only the subject term is distributed. No fast food franchises are benevolent employers. That's an E, so it's a universal negative, and both terms are distributed, both the subject and the predicate. Some professors with beards are avid players of the Old Republic. Right? Well, both terms are undistributed, and that's a particular affirmative. All real Plato scholars are students of the Greek language. Right? That's a universal affirmative, and only the subject term is distributed. No politicians who support corporations instead of their constituents are persons of integrity, and that's a universal negative, and both terms are distributed. And some cats are infuriating beasts. Well, that's an I, so it's a particular affirmative, and both terms are undistributed. So that's how we think about the distribution of terms. You need to have all this pretty much memorized, and it'll become clear to you in just a little bit why this is important. Thank you very much for your kind attention.